Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Just as a very broad introduction, my name, as I said, is Shannon O'Hagan, and a little background information about me is that I am a Senior International Student Recruiter at the University of Kansas, also known as KU. So I am joining you from right in the middle of the U.S., as you see on that map there. KU is a large research university located centrally, and we have bachelor's through PhD programs. And so what I do is I do give presentations and work with students like yourselves to advise on the admissions process. I enjoy doing that for both my university as well as for the U.S. in general. I enjoy kind of providing that guidance and helping students along the way and helping to simplify what can sometimes seem to be a little bit of a complicated process. So I do that from right here in Kansas, and I also travel abroad. So currently I visited 31 countries, which I've really enjoyed my travels, and I hope to continue to travel in the months and years to come. So, as far as the actual presentation goes, I think a good place to start is talking about U.S. higher education in general. So many of you, if you're considering studies in the U.S., are probably at least a little bit familiar with the U.S. higher education system. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but I think it's important to understand the U.S. education system for understanding the U.S. admissions process. So as you may or may not know, there are over 4,000 institutions of higher education in the U.S. That's a lot of universities. And what's interesting and sometimes complicated is that it's a very decentralized system. And what I mean by that is that the system is, there's not really a central ministry of education or any kind of central governing body that sets the particular requirements for the different universities and different institutional types. It is handled by the different state governments, and then they are accredited by different regional accreditation bodies that are separate from the government entities, so they're third parties. And that, I won't get into all the complications of that, but what's important to know about that is that it's not a unified structure from one university to the other, which is why that you will find so many differences from university to university. The good thing, though, is that despite having such a high quantity of institutions, that you will also find a very high quality of programs available. And as I mentioned, they are accredited, so accreditation is what we use to ensure the quality of education in the United States. So as long as you're attending an accredited university, you know that it has met quality standards. You can also do a whole bunch of factors to determine quality, and that's something that we can get into later, perhaps in a different presentation. But as you are searching for universities, some of the things of quality that you'll look for will vary from university to university, and they might be up to your individual interests and what's the most important to you. But in general, again, about the higher education system is that you will find many different universities, many different types. You will find different sizes, you will find different structures. You will find universities that focus on research. You will find universities that focus on a particular specialized field. So there's a lot of different options out there for you for your studies, depending on what your interests might be. Now, as I was kind of tying it back to from the beginning, I think this is important to know to realize how these characteristics impact the application process. One of the big things that I like to point out is that when you have such a diverse system and that it is decentralized, you're going to find differences from university to university in how you apply. Those different universities have their own authority to determine what those particular application requirements are for their university. Another thing with the higher education system is that we really value the holistic learning. That whole person. So that's another set. It's a reflection of U.S. higher education. So what I mean by that is that often universities aren't going to look at a single test score or a single academic record to determine your admission. They're going to look at a variety of factors because they want to know about you as a whole person and about the different things that you're passionate about, the different elements of what it is that makes you, you. So some of the things that you will find that do vary from institution by institution are listed here. So the materials required for applying to universities will vary. I'm going to talk about some of the general ones you might expect. But it's important to know that some universities will require all of the things I talk about. Some of them might only require a couple of them because it varies from university to university. Similarly, each university will set their own minimum standards. So whereas you might apply to, say, a chemical engineering program at one university, and they're going to require you to take a standardized test and maybe earn a certain level of academic success, so a grade point average of, let's say, a 3.0 on a 4.0 scale, and I'll get into that in a bit. Another university might have an even higher standard or a lower standard, so it will vary from university to university. The review process will also vary from institution to institution. So some universities might be able to admit you if you meet the minimum requirements. Some of them might be more selective, and it might take a little bit longer for them to compare you against other applicants to determine whether or not you meet their criteria and whether or not it's a good fit. And also, the one I always like to highlight are deadlines. Each university sets their own deadlines. Sometimes each program sets their own deadlines. So it's really important early in the process for you to become aware of deadlines so that you don't miss out on the opportunities available. So again, I give you these examples before I get into the details of the process because it's important to know that the information that I provide is going to be general, and you'll need to find out the specific details for the particular universities that you're wishing to apply to. It's also important to remember, as I have noted on the bottom, that not only are there going to be some variances from university to university, but you also might find some variances within the individual university. So the admission requirements for, let's say, an arts program might be very different from the admission requirements for, let's say, a business program. Some universities that could be the same, but some they will be different. So the main point I'm trying to get across here is that there are variations from university to university and even sometimes from program to program. So getting started, I think one of the most important things to realize is that the search process, I like to think of it as actually kind of step one in your application process. Because things do vary from university to university, it's important to find the right institution for you and to research those things that are going to be different and to know what it is expected of the universities that you're most excited to apply to. So for finding the right institution for you, these are just some of the questions that I suggest to ask yourself as you are going through that search process. Most importantly, likely for you, is your academic program. So whether you're at the bachelor's degree or PhD level or in between there, it's important that the university that you plan to go to has the program available that you want to study. Makes sense, right? But where sometimes students get caught up on this is that they might be really excited to apply to a university that they've heard a lot about. So it has a lot of name recognition, a lot of really good reputation, maybe perhaps like an Ivy League school. And that's certainly great. There's absolutely nothing wrong with Ivy League schools. They're wonderful institutions. But if those universities do not offer the academic program that you wish to study, then it's probably not going to be a good fit for you and what you're wanting to pursue long term. So just to keep that in mind as you are going through the search process. These are some other things to think about. With the institution, is the location important to you? What type of university are you wanting to study at? Do you think you would do better in a large university setting or a small university setting? And kind of weighing out the advantages and disadvantages to both. Similarly, what is the climate? If you are really concerned with weather and you just absolutely hate snow, then maybe you don't want to go to a place where it snows, a very harsh winter, for example. So these are some of the factors to think about, and they sound like common sense, of course, and some of them are, but I think it's important to take the time to think this through before you begin the application process to see if you can really picture yourself at that university. So once you do kind of go through this, I guess these are some of my tips that I have for how to manage that process and how to best go about it. One of the things is a very simple tool that I recommend students try out, and again, no matter what your level of study is to create a spreadsheet or a similar tool to really help you to organize this information. This will really help you throughout that application process to make sure you're staying on top of the different requirements for the different universities that you are interested in applying to. This also helps you to compare universities against one another. So you might start with a rather large spreadsheet, and that might help you to kind of narrow down and see which ones truly are a good fit. Why I also encourage you to use a tool like this is because this can help you to set what those priority areas are for you. So for example, if you have identified, your academic program as being the most important thing, great. So you can list some information about that program and the different programs for the different institutions you're considering. So this is especially important, I would say, at the master's and PhD level. As you are learning more about the program, you might get into really detailed information about the particular research areas of the faculty. You might look and see what types of projects past or current students are doing in that field. You might just get some really detailed columns, but I think this is one way that I recommend to really help organize that information so that you can keep it straight. I know that it can sometimes get confusing or overwhelming if you are searching so many different universities and you're learning really great things about the different universities, but then you might start getting them confused. So this is just one way to remember that, for example, this University A has a great program in molecular biosciences, and so does University B, but these are the things that make them different and unique. So the other tips I have on here is to assess your own potential for admission. What I mean by that is to kind of be realistic with yourself as far as whether or not you meet your admission criteria. For example, if the university has a requirement for minimum work experience or professional experience of some capacity and you have none, then you should probably be aware that that might limit you in that particular program. That said, it's also important to start a dialogue with the university. So if you're not sure if, say, that minimum work experience requirement is truly a requirement or a recommendation, that's something that you can ask along the way. There are people like myself at the different universities in the U.S. who can certainly assist you throughout the process and answer your questions about the general admission. For master's and PhD level students, I always recommend really trying to establish that relationship with the academic department as well, because they're the ones who are the experts on their program, and they can really kind of get into those details. It sounds like there's some sound issues, so let me see here. If it's a little bit too loud, let me try to adjust that on my end. Okay, I just tried to turn it down just a little bit, but let me know if that was too much. And you can also try adjusting the volume on your speakers as well, but please continue to, oh great, thank you, adjust it. Okay, so I'll continue. My apologies there for the interruption there, but any other feedback, please do feel free to let me know. Okay, so like I was saying, you'll want to assess your own potential for admission, to reach out to those universities to ask your questions about your different circumstances and whether or not you meet the criteria and things like that. Also, once you are kind of going through this process, you will want to kind of narrow it down, use the tool that I mentioned to really try to focus in and determine which universities you'll want to apply to. Sometimes students can get very excited and want to apply to 20, 30 universities, and that's a lot to manage. So my advice is to try to narrow it down and focus onto a smaller number than that to try to decide where you really want to apply and what might be a good fit for you. So once you have decided where you want to apply, that's great. That's a really big first step once you've kind of narrowed it down. So now we're going to talk about what happens next and the actual elements that you can expect of the U.S. admissions process. And I'll begin first with undergraduate admission. So for undergraduate admissions, this is for bachelor's degree programs. So in other words, for programs that you enter after you've completed secondary school or high school. The way I like to break it down for undergraduate admissions is to have it for kind of two different categories. So there's kind of your standard admission requirements materials and then your supplemental materials. And I'll start by talking about your standard materials. So first, most universities will require an online application. Some still accept paper, but online is definitely a preferred method to apply to universities, and most will have an application fee associated with that. At the bachelor's degree level, there is something called the common application. And that is something that is an application you can fill out and then use that application to apply to many different universities that are part of that common application system. So that's something to be aware of. However, probably I would argue most universities have their own application and their own independent application fee. So just to kind of be aware of that and to look at that as one element in the application process to see what type of application that they have. The second very common thing is your academic records. So this will be your past academic work. Makes sense, right? We want to see that you, how you have done in your past coursework. Most universities will require official academic records, and what that means is that they will require records that will be sent directly from your past school, past high school, for example, and that they have to be sent directly from the school in a sealed envelope. And that sounds very picky, but they need to make sure that those records are truly official and that they have not been tampered with in some way. Another thing that might be helpful to know is that you can submit your most recent academic records or marks. You do not have to wait until you graduate to apply. Many students apply in their final year of studies, so we can begin the application process. Most universities can admit you based on the work you have done so far, and then they would require a final academic transcript after you have graduated. For my university, for example, we can admit you based on the coursework you've completed up to that point. You would then submit your final diploma or your final proof of graduation from high school, and also send an official final copy of your records. Some students mail that into us before they arrive, and some students bring it to us once they arrive on campus and before they enroll in academic courses. Let's see, it sounds like we're still having some volume issues, but I'm not quite sure what I can do to adjust that. On my end, it looks like it's all going through clearly. Oh, someone can, well that's good. So I'll try to speak as clearly as I can, and I apologize that we are having some volume issues. Okay, the other thing that is required at some universities are test scores. Now this is something that will vary from university to university as far as what is required and what might be just recommended. One of those is the SAT or ACT. These are general aptitude exams. So basically they're exams that university students, that students take to get into university in the US. So US citizens who are applying to US universities are often required to take either the SAT or the ACT to gain admission into US universities. Now for international students, it's going to vary from university to university whether this is required. Again, just to use my university as an example, we would not require the SAT or ACT for general admission, but some of our professional schools, like business engineering, do require it, and we also require it for scholarship consideration. Now, I just use that as an example to show you that this is one that really does vary a lot depending on the circumstances. But my advice is that if you are able to take the SAT or ACT, to go ahead and do so, because that way you're not limiting your options. Another exam that is very frequently required is either the TOEFL or the IELTS score, or TOEFL or IELTS exam. And these exams are English proficiency exams. You perhaps have heard of them. And these exams, again, will vary as far as what the minimum score is required, but most universities will require some form of English proficiency. Some universities will accept the SAT or ACT to fulfill this requirement, but some will not. So again, I recommend that you do take these exams if you're able to do so. Another standard material is the documentation of finances. And this is actually a student visa requirement and not really an academic admissions requirement, but it's one thing that is required, so it's worth mentioning. I do like to make that explanation that it is a visa requirement, however, because I think it's important for students to know that your admission to university is not typically based on your actual finances. So we evaluate you based on your academic background, and we require this financial piece because it's required with student visa to determine that you are able to actually study at our universities. But as far as how we evaluate you, we're not going to consider students less based on their financial situation. Now we'll get into kind of more of those supplemental materials that may or may not be required at the bachelor's degree level or undergraduate level. Those things are things you've likely heard about, but for example, an essay or statement of purpose might be required. Sometimes it's required at the point of admission. Sometimes it's just required for scholarship consideration. But oftentimes you will find that it's worth it to kind of have at least kind of a sample one ready and prepared, again, so you don't limit your options. And I'll get into some tips for the essay in just a bit. Also, letters of recommendation. Oftentimes these are required by many different universities in some capacity. Again, sometimes it's more for scholarship consideration than actual admission, but you might want to start thinking early on about who you might ask for a letter of recommendation. Similarly, some universities will require a resume, a CV, or a co-curricular summary. And basically what this is just kind of showing your experiences beyond the classroom, or some of your accomplishments that maybe you're not able to list in the application itself. This just gives universities a chance to know more about you and to see the different types of things that you have been involved with. This is a good chance for you too, as I mentioned, to demonstrate both the breadth and the depth of your involvement. So what I mean by that is that, you know, if you've been involved in many different types of things, that would be the breadth of your involvement, so that you have a variety of different experiences. And by depth, I mean that perhaps you have persisted in the same organization. Like maybe you started out in a student club and then you became that club's secretary and then you became that club's president, or whatever the case may be for you. But you have perhaps stayed in that same organization and taken on some leadership. And for this particular requirement, I always say that when in doubt, to go ahead and include it. And what I mean by that is sometimes students might not think that, let's say, their community service is something that they could include because they don't necessarily have, you know, proof that they have completed X number of hours. But it's important to go ahead and include it because it's helpful for us to see. I mean, we want you to be honest, of course, but it's still worth it for you to put it down as a bit of information. And then if universities have questions about it, they can certainly ask you. Some other possible requirements that may or may not be required are listed here. And these are often for somewhat more specialized majors or programs. So as I've listed here, like a portfolio for an art program or a design program is sometimes required for admission. An audition is often required for a music type program. And then some universities will include an interview as a requirement for admission or for scholarship consideration. And, you know, of course, with you being overseas and perhaps not available to come to campus in person, many universities are able to arrange to do this type of interview by Skype, but they can certainly let you know of what those requirements are and how that would work depending on the university. Okay, so that was undergraduate admissions, both the standard and the supplemental materials. So as a quick review there, we had their standard materials, application and application fee, your academic records, your test scores, your documentation of financial support, and then potential supplemental materials like an essay, letters of recommendation, a resume, or other requirements. Now we'll go on to the graduate application process, so specifically talking about master's and PhD programs. And before I get into details here, I will say that most of them will look very similar to what is required for undergraduate admissions. But what's I think really important to highlight for the graduate level is that at many universities, the graduate process tends to be a little bit more decentralized. So a lot of times the process is handled more by the academic departments instead of a centralized admissions office. The centralized admissions office often exists at the graduate level on campuses, but they tend to be more involved in the processing of the application, kind of the paperwork stuff. And the academic departments are the ones who really set the criteria for their departments and who evaluate the applicants for admission. This is another thing, again, that will vary from university to university. So universities with smaller amounts of grad programs might have it more centralized, and universities with many different grad programs might have it kind of from department to department. So it's just part of the thing that, again, you'll want to look for in your university search process, but just to be aware of that you will find some variations here, particularly at the master's and even more so at the PhD level. But in general, we'll go into some of the elements that are required. So these are the general graduate application materials. As I mentioned, very similar to what you saw before, but they are a little bit different in the actual process. So oftentimes there is going to be kind of that same standard application and application fee. Many of this, again, will be required to be online. Again, they will require your academic records. Oftentimes, let's say if you're applying to a master's level program, then they would require the academic records specifically from your bachelor's level program. Applying for a PhD program, they would likely require your master's level work and possibly your undergraduate, your bachelor's level work as well. Kind of depends on the program. Additionally, English proficiency exam scores. This is another element that's pretty standard from the undergraduate level as well, so often TOEFL or IELTS exam scores. You might find that the master's and PhD level, they might require a higher level of proficiency, especially if you wish to be considered for, say, a graduate teaching assistantship or a graduate research assistantship, because those are kind of like positions within the department. So you might, if you're wanting to be considered to essentially teach within that department as you're earning your bachelor or your master's or PhD, then they would need you to be able to, of course, have a strong English proficiency, strong speaking skills, and things like that. So that's why a lot of times they do require a higher level. You will find variations from university to university on whether or not they are flexible on their TOEFL or IELTS minimum scores. At KU, we're pretty strict with our English proficiency requirements. Some universities are able to offer something that's, you might be heard of, like conditional admission, where if you don't quite meet the criteria, then you may begin in the English program. So basically what I'm saying is you will find variations for this requirement for master's and PhD level study. Another element that does vary from program to program is the exam scores. So perhaps the most common kind of standard exam score that I guess you could say would be sort of equivalent to like the SAT, ACT at the undergraduate level. Well, at the master's, PhD level, that type of exam would be a GRE exam. So that's another kind of general knowledge type exam to evaluate your skills and your abilities and all of that kind of thing. So that is one exam that is often required. And there are also some other types at the graduate level that are, they vary by specialization. So the GMAT, for example, is one that's often required for business programs. The LSAT is one that's often required for law programs, the PCAT for pharmacy. So there are different types of exams available. So kind of just include that in part of your research for the programs that you wish to apply for. Now, references or letters of recommendation are very often required as part of the graduate application materials. Now, these letters of reference or recommendation, sometimes they are truly letters that they ask you to submit with the application. Sometimes they're references, and the difference there being that they would ask you to supply the contact details of the people who would be referring you, or speaking on your behalf, and then they would send information to that person and ask them questions about you. So it's kind of a different variations of the same general concept. Often a resume or CV is also required as a pretty standard material. This is, again, kind of showing your past work and experiences. This will vary from, unlike the undergraduate level where it is a little bit more about extracurricular type activities, at the master's and PhD level, a lot of times what they're wanting to see is perhaps your accomplishments in that particular field. So perhaps if you've been involved in research, if you have work experience, professional experience, if you've participated in professional conferences, things like that, those are all good things to include. Now, certainly, if you also have community involvement and different kind of beyond the classroom type experiences and achievements, then that's great as well, and you can certainly include those. But I would say the focus tends to be a little bit more academic or professional for master's and PhD level programs. That documentation of finances that I described previously is also required. And then those other possible requirements are also listed here as well. So you'll also find those types of variations at the master's and PhD level. Okay, so that kind of goes through, again, the undergraduate requirements, the graduate application materials. Now what I'm going to talk about kind of briefly is writing an effective essay. So I know this is one element that people tend to be a little bit intimidated by when they are applying to U.S. universities. And I will say that there, and I put this at the bottom here, but I'll start with this here, is that there are differences between undergraduate and graduate essays. So as far as the focus and what you'll write about will probably be different depending on you applying for a bachelor's program versus master's PhD. For all of those things, these are some general tips to keep in mind. I'm not sure if this is a universal symbol, but one of the things that we use here in the US is kind of this hamburger model or the sandwich model, which you see listed on the right-hand side. So the reason I put this is a way to kind of structure your essay. So you'll want to make sure that this essay has nice structure to it, that there is a strong introduction. So that would be the bun, the top bun or the top part of your sandwich. You have the body paragraphs, which are the meat, so kind of the insides of the sandwich, meat or veggies if you're vegetarian. So those are the types of things that you'll really want to focus on as far as the focus of your essay, and really talk about the heart of what you're trying to get to with whatever your topic might be. And then the bottom bun or bottom layer of bread for your sandwich is the conclusion. So the reason we kind of use this image is to show you that you want to make sure it has a kind of a clear structure, beginning, middle, and end. Another thing I think it's important to think about for writing an effective essay is the actual purpose as well as your audience. So this sounds, again, something that's obvious, but I think it's something that sometimes students tend to miss a little bit. And what I mean by this, so first, the purpose. You're often writing this essay for admission to a university program. And the people who will be reading this essay are admissions counselors such as myself or academic departments. So when you're writing your essay, and if you have a topic, let's say, why you want to study this program, that we certainly want to know more about you through writing this essay. That's kind of the overall point. So the purpose would be to help us understand why you would be a good fit for this particular program. So you'll want to tell us more about yourself, you'll want to have a very focused message for doing it, and you'll want to kind of put it in context of the university. So for example, some students might write a lot of information, and they'll try to kind of tell their life story when there's really not space to do that. So you'll want to have kind of a focused message for narrowing it down and kind of use it to tell a story or to tell something significant about you. And I think another thing that sometimes students do is that they'll write a very general essay and use it to apply to many different universities. And I certainly understand that, because I understand that it's a challenging process and a lot of information to cover. However, if you can kind of tailor it to that university, it shows us that you really are interested in our particular institutions. So if you're able to highlight some of the things that most interest you, so you might say that you are excited to study at a particular university because of their aerospace engineering department and the accomplishments of the faculty member, whatever the case is for you, to kind of just show us that you have done your research and that you are interested in our particular university. Now again, it's going to vary depending on what that situation is for you, and we want it to be genuine and authentic, as I have listed here. So you do want to still keep it focused, but just to try to tie in those different types of elements. And I know that's challenging, but we really do want to know more about you and why you want to study our university. I think is kind of the thing to remember. And since space is limited, you do want to have a particular focus, as I mentioned. You want to try to pay attention to those word counts, for example, that universities have listed. If someone says 500 words is required, try to stay within those 500 words. Most universities, if you're a couple words over, it's not the end of the world and they'll still consider you. But some, if you go over, that's one reason to, pass yours aside and go on to the next, because they have so many to review, and if you don't follow instructions, etc., that you might not meet those requirements. So just to be mindful of of the directions and what it is that the university is asking. You also want to demonstrate strong writing skills. So again, this sounds very common sense, but sometimes those little things can really kind of be distracting. Certain universities, again, similar with word count, may be more or less strict on the grammar side of things, but it is distracting sometimes when you're reading an essay and you know what the student's trying to say, but then if they have a lot of spelling errors or grammatical mistakes, it can detract from the overall message. So just take the extra time, have someone proofread, and you'll be better off. Another thing is to really kind of avoid some of the common pitfalls of essays that, again, can be a little bit distracting. So some of those are cliches, rhetorical questions, and the overuse of quotations. These things, again, can kind of detract from us getting to know you. So if you're using kind of just very vague common sayings or rhetorical questions or as it says, quotations here, then we have a harder time getting to know who you are, who the authentic you is, and what it is that interests you about the program or about the particular topic. Something that I'll point out that's a little bit different from undergraduate to graduate level essays is that at the master's PhD level, oftentimes they're going to require a statement of purpose, so it is one of those things that is going to be more focused on the actual academic program. At the undergraduate level, it might be a little bit more broad, so it might be talking about a learning experience you have had, or talking about your passions or things like that, which is great and valid. But at the master's PhD level, oftentimes it's a bit more focused in on why this particular program and how does your background fit into qualifying you for the program. So what's important to realize there is that it's also a little bit different than, say, UK admissions. I know that's one where in the United Kingdom schools, sometimes they have more of a research proposal that's required at the time of admission. And I just mentioned this because I get questions about it kind of frequently, where students say, do I have to submit a research proposal? So I had to learn what they meant by that. So it's not quite the same as a research proposal. It's a little bit more broad, and it's a little bit more talking about your the fit piece, finding the right fit and telling us more about you and your interests and what you hope to do with them. But it's a little bit less, it's just structured differently than a research proposal. So if you kind of want to know those differences, that's something that we can get into perhaps later on, or working with an advising center or something like that to kind of talk about some of those differences there. Okay, so now we'll talk about references and letters of recommendation. This is another really important element like we talked about. So I always advise thinking early on about who it is that you want to ask for a letter of recommendation or reference, and make sure, it's kind of a courtesy thing as well. Make sure that they know they're a reference so that it's not a surprise, for example, if the university sends them an email asking for details about you. And make sure that you do have their current details so that the university can get in touch with them and if they do have questions. If the referrer does write the reference or letter of recommendation in a different language, make sure you do include an English translation for the universities so that it's easier, of course, to read. Another element that I have here is that title is far less important than relationship. And what I mean by this is that, let's say, for example, that you have a friend of a friend of a friend of an uncle of a friend, or whatever the case may be, who is the CEO of a huge company or is this huge politician or just, a really big deal and with a great title. Well, that's great, but if that person doesn't know you well, they're probably not going to be the best reference. So even if they have a great title, it's not as much what universities are looking for. Often what we're looking for is someone who knows you well and can speak to your abilities. So I have it kind of broken down here on who to ask and who not to ask. The most important people to ask, I would say, would be kind of academic references. So teachers or professors, perhaps a high school counselor, people who know your accomplishments, who know your strengths, and can kind of speak to those abilities and can translate those to the university staff. So a lot of times these letters of recommendation or references are used to kind of validate some of the information that you've included in the rest of your materials. So if you've talked about, a big research project you've been involved with, then perhaps you would ask the advisor for that research project to write a letter of reference so that they can kind of talk about supervising you in that capacity so that we can see both sides of that experience. If you have a professional work experience or part-time work experience, that's another person you can ask as a past or a current employer. And then just people in general who can speak to your abilities. Again, this should be someone who knows you well and in kind of a specific capacity. So if you are highly involved in community organizations, or at the undergraduate level, let's say in high school you've been involved in sports or other clubs and activities, then the coaches or sponsors of those organizations would be people you could also ask. I would say to always try to kind of focus it more on the academic side. So if you, for example, have 3 letters of recommendation required, I would say have at least 1 be academic, preferably 2. It could be all 3, but you want to make sure that it is kind of for bachelor's degree, well, actually both levels, to make sure that they are mostly academic references, and then you might have, say, 1 that is a non-academic reference. And then as far as who not to ask, these are the people that unfortunately don't make the best references for you in the application process, and that would be family members. And the reason for that is because, they love you, and that's great, and you have a good relationship, hopefully, with your family, and that's great as well. But sometimes they're a little biased, and so it's just not as appropriate in the application process. Same thing with personal friends, or, as I mentioned before, like a distant contact who does not really know you all that well. So those are all things to keep in mind. Okay. And then I'm going to these last few I'll go through fairly quickly because I do want to save plenty of time for questions. These are just some general tips I have for success in the application process. As I've kind of mentioned before, just make sure you read the directions and pay attention to what is required of the specific university that you are applying to. Another one that I like to highlight is don't be too humble. Sometimes students find it difficult to share their successes, and so they might not include everything that they should in that resume, for example. But we want you to share your different accomplishments in the essay and in the resume or CV. Because I have had essays before where people end up writing more about someone else instead of themselves. They might write about the accomplishments of, say, a professional person that they admire, or even a family member that they admire. And that's great, but what they fail to do is to tie it back to themselves and talk about how that has inspired them, the student, to then become successful in that field. So just to make sure that you are talking about yourself, because this is our chance to get to know you. Also, of course, proofread your materials and be honest in your different materials and in your interactions. University reps have a tendency to figure out, they have a special sense to know when something just doesn't quite seem right about an application. So just be honest and then you're fine. And then also just represent yourself well in your interactions, like with emails and things. Some emails I get are not the best writing, and that's okay. I mean, I don't expect you to write perfectly when you email me, but sometimes it's just very informal and very much like receiving a text message. And I mean, I'm not offended by that, but I know there are some people who are a little bit more strict in their interactions with students, where that might kind of turn them away when they ultimately do get that essay and think that perhaps the student's not as serious or something like that. So just be aware that you are making an impression in those interactions. And finally, I think what's important to do is, these are a lot of things to take into consideration, right? There's a lot of elements required here. So at some point, once you get everything submitted, and once you have that essay where you like it, once you have those references that you're excited to have, and once you kind of submit everything to the university, you just kind of have to sit back and think, did that application portray me, the student, as I want to be portrayed? So if it did, then you've really done your job, because there's only so much that you can do. And so as long as you're happy with your application materials and how it represents you as a student, then you have done your job in the application process. And finally, my last little point here is about deadlines. I always like to highlight this because it's just one of those things that kind of trips students up sometimes. It's just that they do vary from university to university. Sometimes they vary from program to program. Sometimes universities have earlier scholarship deadlines or consideration for other types of funding. So when you're doing that overall spreadsheet, where you're marking out all the different elements that are important to you, make sure that you have a column for deadlines and that you are just aware of when the deadlines are for the programs that excite you the most. That way you don't miss out on any opportunities. And that wraps up what I was wanting to say as far as kind of the general overview of all this information. I know it was a lot to take in, so thank you for your patience and your time. And at this time, I will go ahead and turn it over to you all for questions. So please go ahead and enter any questions you might have into the chat, and then I will reply to those. I will read out the questions and then reply to those. So I turn it over to you all, and thank you all for coming and for being attentive participants. I appreciate it.